Hey, how's it going everybody? J-Mac here. Today's video is going to be on the Kanai's cube and optimization with the cube for the Witch Doctor class. First we're going to go over just general useful items in the cube, and then we'll go over what I think are the best setups for the in-game builds such as Carnival and Helltooth, etc. Now something to keep in mind with the cube is that if you cube an item, it always has its highest range in the cube. So as an example, the furnace rolls between 40 and 50% elite damage. So even if you have a furnace that say rolled 43% elite damage and you cube that furnace, you're going to have 50% elite damage in the cube whenever you run the furnace. First up we have the weapons, and the first weapon we're going to look at is the Star Metal Kukri. By far one of the most powerful weapons in the game, and it's going to be good in just about every Witch Doctor setup. It's going to shine in Carnival builds, because with the Slam Dance Rune you're getting attack speed and damage, and since fetishes shoot darts when you do, attack speed is king in those builds. It'll also be very good in Helltooth variations. Say you're running an Acid Cloud build, if you run Rain Dance on your bar, that takes care of literally all your mana problems. We're able to just spam Acid Cloud at that point. Or if you're running a Zombie Bears Zombie Charger variation with the Scrimshaw, you're not going to have as many mana problems, so you're able to run Slam Dance for that attack speed and damage buff instead. It will also be very good in Z DPS builds. Yes, 0 DPS Witch Doctor is still a thing in Season 4. It's not going to be quite the same without the permanent fear that we had before this patch, but it can still buff and debuff while crowd controlling pretty decently, and having that SMK with either running Fetish Sycophants or the Belt of Transcendence to proc it to give your party that attack speed and damage buff. Still very, very good there. Overall, one of the best weapons. I think its biggest knock is its mobility. You have to stand in the Slam Dance to get the buff, and things like Furnace are much higher mobility weapons because of that. And the other thing is just that you have to have Big Bad Voodoo on your bar. It definitely takes up a skill slot, which other weapons in the cube do not. Next up we have the Furnace, and again one of its biggest strengths is just the high mobility of the Furnace. You don't have to do anything to get the damage buff, it's just static on your character once it's in the cube, and I think that's the best thing about it. You don't have to have anything on your bar. And it's also very good because of the mobility for speed builds for Torment 10 farming. A lot of times in speed builds for Torment 10, especially with Witch Doctor, you kill the white mobs very quickly because you have very good AoE damage, but you may need a little bit more damage against those elites and champions and rift bosses to make sure that your clear times are as fast and efficient as possible. Next up we have the Dagger of Darts. In Season 4, really whichever one you get first as an Ancient, either the Dagger of Darts or the Star Metal Kukri, if you're going to run a Carnival setup, you run that on your character and then you cube the other one. So if you drop a Ancient SMK first, go ahead and cube your Dagger of Darts, and vice versa. That's really the only reason to cube Dagger of Darts in general. Next up we have the Engiam. This weapon is really only good for speed builds, so if you're running Torment 10 or less, or Greater Rifts at a very fast pace where you're killing elites and champions very quickly, then this weapon is quite good in the cube, especially for, builds like if you're running, say, a Firewall setup in Torment 10, where Firewall does very significant damage now with Jerem's Bracers, but it has an 8-second cooldown. Well, once you kill that first elite or champion with the Engiam, it now has a 0 cooldown, and you're able to just spam Firewall on all the mobs for very quick clear speeds at that point. Next we have the Wormwood. This is really for if you have your heart set on playing Jade Harvester still, although I really wouldn't recommend it. But it's probably still fine for Torment levels if you're just doing regular Nephilim Rifts. The other option would be in the Arakiers set. The 6-piece bonus from Arakiers actually buffs Locust Swarm damage, so this is a good passive way to deal damage with it without ever having to actually cast it from your bar. Next we have the Renho Flayer. Now this is a weapon that's probably not going to be ran in high-level Greater Rifting, but it's definitely an option in Torment 10 or less, or Greater Rifts 45 to 55-ish. Toads get buffed by both the 6-piece Arakier set and the 6-piece Helltooth set, so both of those sets are an option with the Renho Flayer. Next up we have the Thunder Fury. I think this is a nice utility debuff for 0 DPS Witch Doctor builds. Now keep in mind, this is just my opinion on which weapons are worth cubing. There are a ton more weapons that you could cube if you want to in Season 4 or non-season as well. The biggest reason why I did not include items like the Suwong Diviner and the Scrimshaw is because the percentage Acid Cloud damage and the percentage Zombie Charger damage are not part of the legendary effect, therefore they are not cubable. With the Scrimshaw, all you can cube is the Zombie Charger mana reduction, and with the Suwong Diviner, all that you can cube is your Acid Cloud gains the effect of the Lob Blob Bomb rune. Also, I did not include any mojos, mainly because they go into the weapon slot, and I think that the weapons in general are way too powerful to ever run a mojo in the weapon slot over an actual weapon. The only one that possibly comes to mind is the Eucapian Serpent. Moving on to the armor slot, first up we have the Mask of Jerem. And this is going to be really great in the cube for Carnival setups especially. It'll also be good for Helltooth Gargantuan builds, although that build isn't quite as good with the most recent PTR patch. And there's even a physical Zuni pet build that I think can push up close to 60 if not 60 that the Mask of Jerem will be good in the cube. And the nice thing about cubing the Mask of Jerem is it will always be 100% pet damage while you're using it in the cube. Next up is the Grin Reaper. This voodoo mask has been buffed significantly in patch 2.3 and even benefits from the 6-piece Helltooth damage buff. This will be great in the cube for any caster variation of Helltooth. The Quetzalcoatl. This has implications in any Arakir set running Locust Swarm or again in a Jade Harvester build. Although like I said before, Jade Harvester isn't really in a terribly good place this patch. Next we have Tasker and Theo. These will be good in really any pet build, and they're notorious for rolling very poorly, so it's nice to get that 50% attack speed in the cube and not having to worry about what kind of roll you got on the gloves. They also could potentially be decent in Carnival now, because the way Carnival works currently is that only 5 fetishes are shooting darts, and the rest are attacking in melee range. So for the first time ever, Taskers could actually be used in a Carnival setup, although I think a Focus and Restraint setup will be better. But maybe early on in the season, if you get Taskers early but you don't have Focus and Restraint yet, that could be an option. Jerem's Bracers are an option in any Helltooth variation, although most of them you will probably cube a Grin Reaper instead. The Belt of Transcendence for the most part will be worn on your character because it doesn't interfere with set item slots. But there are certain builds where you may cube it, depending on if you want to also run a Witching Hour, because you cannot cube the ability from the Witching Hour. It's just crit damage. It doesn't have a legendary affix. Or potentially in a ZDPS Witch Doctor build to run a String of Ears. Strong Arm Bracers are really always an option for any build running Paranado for another damage buff. Next up, the Hexing Pants of Mr. Yan. These are really an option for any high mobility build where you're dealing damage as you're moving, or you stop for just a split second to deal damage and then move again to keep that damage buff going. Things like the new revamped Manajuma set with Angry Chicken come to mind. Warzekian Arm Guards are an option for any kind of speed, Torment 10 or less setup. Next up we have the Cindercoat. This is probably going to be at its best in a Arakir 6-piece setup with Cloud of Bats to reduce the mana cost of fire spells. Additionally, possibly a 6-piece Helltooth variation running Corpse Bomb or Zombie Charger Explosive Beast. Also, keep in mind you can only cube the resource cost reduction, you cannot cube the fire damage on the Cindercoat. Gold Wrap is great for Torment 10 farming. You're able to build completely glass cannon and get all of your toughness from the Gold Wrap with good pickup radius. The Gloves of Worship. This is another item that's very good for speed farming and Torment levels. If you're moving fast enough, you should be able to keep the majority of shrine buffs going pretty much all the time. The Pauldrons of the Skeleton King. This item gives you a second life and is probably at its best in glass cannon builds. Next up, the Crims Buff Belt, another very good item for speed farming lower difficulties. Next up we have the Leoric's Crown. This is going to be at its best in an Arakir 6-piece Angry Chicken Manajuma setup, where you're trying to get your Angry Chicken's cooldown as low as possible. So you put this in the cube, along with a CDR cooldown reduction gem in your helmet. The Harrington Waistguard is great for any build running normal rifts, or just regular bounty runs, where there's a lot of clickable items. The Coils of the First Spider are good in any 6-piece Arakir build running Fire Bats, although more than likely you'll run them on your character because they don't interfere with any of the set piece slots. Next up, we have the jewelry slot, and first up is Ring of Royal Grandeur. Probably makes the most obvious sense out of all the jewelry, mainly because it rolls horribly, so it's much better to have it in the cube, and it's just very powerful. It's fantastic in Carnival, allowing you to run Focus and Restraint, and it's just good in any set that doesn't want to run every single piece of the set. Next up is the Convention of Elements. It's the highest DPS standalone ring, excluding Focus and Restraint, and it's really at its best in any builds that are running Focus and Restraint on your character are able to get their full 6-piece bonus without Ring of Royal Grandeur, and then can have Convention of Elements in the cube. If you're wanting to run both the Short Man's Finger and the Tall Man's Finger in a dedicated pet build, more than likely you're going to need to either cube one or the other to maximize your damage and the build. The Broken Promises ring is at least one that I want to mention. I haven't found any good 0 crit chance builds for Witch Doctor just yet, but it's possible that one emerges during the season, so at the very least keep it on your radar. Next up, we have the Unity. I think you can definitely get away without running it as a Witch Doctor with things like Swampland Attunement, Bad Medicine, stuff like that. But it is there as an option if you want to go the double Unity route with your follower to get that damage reduction. The Oculus Ring has potential uses on ZDPS Witch Doctors. You're not always going to get the last hit to proc this, but you'll get it often enough to make it useful. The Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac is another great ring for ZDPS Witch Doctors. Because it rolls so strangely, it's a great option for the cube, and with the Haunt spam that you're normally doing in a ZDPS build, you'll reduce the cooldown of your other skills significantly. Next up, the Rochelle's Ring of Larceny, another great item with Horrify for speedruns in Torment 10 or Bounties. The Avarice Band is one of the best rings in my opinion for speedrunning. Getting that 30 pickup radius, potentially depending on how fast you're moving and how much gold you're picking up, is fantastic, especially in Witch Doctor builds that can't utilize the Thing of the Deep offhand for the 20 pickup radius. Again, this is just my opinion on what I think is good in the cube. You may find that you like some other items that I left out more and put those in instead. Now let's go over what I think are the best cube setups for each endgame build for the Witch Doctor. First up, we have the Carnival build. In the weapon slot, we have the Star Metal Kukri as the best weapon. This gives you permanent Big Bad Voodoo with all the fetishes that you have, reducing the cooldown of Slam Dance, Big Bad Voodoo. And this gives you attack speed and damage. And then we've got the Mask of Jerem in the armor slot. 100% more pet damage. It's going to buff all of your fetishes, all 22 to 23 that you have out, depending on which rune of fetish armor you're running, whether it be the poison rune or the physical rune. And then we've got the Ring of Royal Grandeur in the jewelry slot. This allows you to run Focus and Restraint as rings, which is just the most powerful jewelry setup. Next up, we have the Acid Cloud variation of Helltooth, capable of pushing up to 65 greater rifts. In the weapon slot, we have the Furnace. I think this is the best option because of high mobility and having a lot of damage against elites, champions, and bosses. An SMK would be another option, but you'd have to fit Big Bad Voodoo onto your bar somewhere. As far as the armor slot goes, the Grin Reaper is going to be your best option. It's been buffed pretty much every PTR patch so far to the point where the mimics from the Grin Reaper are doing very good damage and at a very long range. Next, we have Convention of Elements in the jewelry slot. We're running full 6-piece Helltooth in this build, and then Focus and Restraint. And Convention of Elements is just the highest DPS standalone ring, as we talked about earlier. Now let's talk about the Zombie Charger variation of Helltooth. Normally running Zombie Charger Zombie Bears as its main damage ability. And it's really the same cube setup as the Acid Cloud version, in my opinion. I think the Furnace is the best weapon in the weapon slot. Again, a Slam Dance with SMK is also something that I've played around with a good bit and is good in the build, but you're much more stationary that way. As far as the armor slot, really any Helltooth caster build, you're going to be running the Grin Reaper. It's just that powerful now with the changes in this patch. And then again, the Convention of Elements ring, because we're running the Focus and Restraint and full Helltooth. Manajuma's Arakir Angry Chicken builds are capable of pushing 60 plus in this patch. And again, I think the best option for the weapon slot is the Furnace. You're running the Manajuma main hand and offhand on your character, and then the Furnace in the weapon slot. As far as the armor slot goes, I think Leoric's Crown is the best option with a cooldown reduction gem in your helmet, because you're really trying to get the cooldown of Angry Chicken as low as possible, That's where the majority of your AoE clear speed is coming from. And then again, in the jewelry slot, the Convention of Elements. In that build, you run Focus and Restraint yet again with full Arakir, and then the Convention of Elements for more damage in the jewelry slot. So there you go, everybody. I hope it helps you going into Season 4 and Patch 2.3 as a Witch Doctor. And if you enjoyed the video, as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.